landscape business since the early 1980s. I always knew there was Frederick Law Olmsted and landscape architecture and design, but I don't know that I really knew it until I came here to Biltmore in 2000. That's when the concepts and the application of Olmsted's design intents were really hammered into me as, what were we trying, what were Olmsted and Vanderbilt trying to accomplish for this wonderful estate. Well, Biltmore is a special place. It is still privately owned by the family. So, um, as as much as anything, I think that continuity of ownership, that thinking about the next generation, and I've been lucky enough to be involved with hearing some of those discussions about the next generation. How do we maintain those design intents, and how do we approach everything from forestry to agriculture, to the profitability of the estate, which is critical. The estate does not have a foundation. It is run as a for-profit business, and our mission statement, I think, says it all. It's a very simple one. It's the preservation of Biltmore as a privately owned, profitable working estate. The preservation, profitability, private ownership, and working estate. There are so many things that tie this estate back to the original ideas of Vanderbilt and Olmsted that come from and have been maintained by that family private ownership. Um, so as George Vanderbilt was buying this property and developing his ideas for what he and his guests would be doing and could do on this property, he asked Frederick Law Olmsted specifically, had he made a mistake? And now the Vanderbilts and Olmsted had worked together in the past, and Olmsted was working on Shelburne Farms as this project was going along as well. So George Vanderbilt trusted Olmsted. I firmly believe that, as you can see how that relationship worked out. Frederick Law Olmsted wrote a letter to George Vanderbilt about how he could develop the property, and talked about farming river bottoms, a number of things, building a pleasure garden close to the house, talked about the deer park and what that would look like and what was appropriate on land such as George Vanderbilt was developing here on the estate. Almost half of that letter dealt with developing a scientifically managed forest. Olmsted, a man of that time and a leader of, developing property and what was happening in the world at that time, understood that the United States just couldn't keep cutting one hillside and moving to the next, cutting the next hillside, moving on to the next. They couldn't keep doing that. He had experienced forestry, obviously, in Europe, as had George Vanderbilt. And half that letter had to do with establishing scientifically managed forest on the property here at Biltmore, and suggested that it would be a great example for the United States, and that it would be a good investment of capital as well. So he was making a business argument as well as a social argument, on why forestry was important and why George Vanderbilt could do what other people could not do. He helped George Vanderbilt hire Gifford Pinchot as the very first forester here. In fact, Gifford Pinchot's first forest management plan was so new in the United States that that forest management plan was presented at the World's Fair in Chicago. And nowadays, you can't have a forest without a forest management plan. It's part of tax and all the other regulations, but that's how new it was in the United States. And that foresight from Frederick Law Olmsted and George Vanderbilt gave birth to the first scientifically managed forest of any size in the United States. And after Pinchot finished up, Schenck, a gentleman from Germany, started, and he initiated the first school of forestry in the United States. So I don't think you could find a more important nugget, more important facet of Biltmore than forestry. Yes, it's a beautiful house, it's a beautiful garden, it's a beautiful landscape, it's a working farm. But forestry, from a historic perspective, is really critical to the estate. There are a lot of favorite memories. One of my favorite memories is rebuilding a pond along our approach road. So Olmsted's drawings, 1893 drawings for the approach road, he talked about the guest arrival experience, that they'd get off the train station, and there was from the train station to the house was 3.5 miles. And think about horse and carriage, that's about an hour to a little over an hour that you are actually on the property coming up this wonderful approach to the house. And so it sets the stage for everything. So we were redoing some sections on the approach road, and there were a number of ponds that had over the years silted in. Suzanne Woodell was the landscape manager at the time, and we had Charlie Beveridge come in and do a presentation on Olmsted to our staff. And we asked him, well, if you were going to redo these ponds on the approach road, who would you talk to? And he said, you got to talk to Christian Zimmerman at Prospect Park. So we went up to Prospect Park, visited Christian, and he was happy enough to come down and help us with this pond work. And this is the key to that design intent that Christian really helped instill in us of how to think about this. So the approach road was designed, and this one pond that we started the project on was the guest would view that in Olmsted's time from horse and carriage or from horseback, and at about 3 to 4 miles an hour. Well, our guests today see that for the most part at 15 to 20 miles an hour, if we can get them to slow up, and at a much lower. They're sitting in a car, so they're looking at it from a different perspective even. So as we were redoing this pond, what Suzanne and Christian worked with is they widened the pond out about a third. They didn't lengthen it, but they just widened it for the length of time you would view it. And the original waterfall that came into the pond was more of an acute angle to the approach road. It was a little more perpendicular, and Christian helped us and worked it. And we found these rocks, by the way. When we started digging out the pond, the rocks for the waterfall were still there. Rocks that had lined one edge of the waterfall, of the pond, were still there. Anyway, and we, working with Christian, that waterfall became more parallel to the road. So the design intent of seeing the water spilling into this small pond over the length, over the distance of water, reworked it for what today's guest might see. Well, I have many favorite spots, and a lot of it have to do with these projects and things that we've done over the years. One of my favorite areas of the garden, though, is in what we now call the azalea garden. And Olmsted Senior laid out this garden and or this area and called it the Glen, and had trees spilling down into much more of an open glen-like area with a stream that flows through it. The stream is very interesting in that it picks up springs from above, but also the fountain overflows, feed into this stream. If water runs down the front of the house on the roof, goes into a gutter, it feeds into this stream. So it's all very the drainage is all very piped and developed to have this stream be a perennial beautiful stream all year round. Um, but that area that Olmsted called the Glen, his son Olmsted Jr. did a plan in 1901, and we know it was for the most part completely installed. That made it much more of a horticultural extravaganza, for lack of a better word. It was much more complex horticulturally. Lots of native plants, lots of ground covers, lots of non-native plants, but collections of hawthorns and everything from water iris in wet bog areas. And Olmsted Jr. added some paths to this garden that crossed over the stream and really added the complexity to it. And then in 1940, Edith Vanderbilt Geary, now she had remarried, George Vanderbilt had passed away, she was remarried, accepted the azaleas from Chauncey Beadle. And Chauncey Beadle dates back to the late 1890s, or maybe even 1890 or so, when Olmsted had worked with George Vanderbilt to hire Chauncey Beadle to develop the nursery for the plants that would be planted all throughout the estate. Chauncey Beadle was still there at the estate in 1940. Edith Vanderbilt accepted his collection of azaleas and other native plants into that garden and renamed the garden the Azalea Garden. So here we have this wonderful garden with these very distinct layers that when you learn about the garden, you know the history, you can read them, you can see them. And so that development and complexity over the years, I think that's why it's one of my favorite spots on the estate. So thinking about the Olmsted landscapes that I've seen, and um, he designed landscapes for people to enjoy and immerse themselves with and in. So even if it was a parkway, it was there was intentionality in how people would use it and what they would get from it from an experiential standpoint. And a lot of landscapes today are, people try really hard to do that. Um, Quite often with hard materials, hardscape, and we relate to that today. Um, Olmsted, and that time, didn't think quite so much in terms of hardscape. He understood water and how that affected people and sound, that light and shadow. A lot of people have discussed that in the past. But I think that to bring it back around, it's Olmsted used his designs, his landscapes were for people. And I think at times he said, that he was always designing and this is my words, for something that he would never see, 20 and 30 and 40 years down the line. That's when his design would begin to mature. Um, he could see that distance in the future. He could see how that would develop. So I would say that defines an Olmsted landscape. Is it's for people. Well, Prospect Park is special, and part of that is I relate to water, so I love the way Prospect Park and the water was there, and also the fact that Christian helped us so much with as I was thinking about this and getting started. Um, the parkways in Louisville come to mind, and I realize they're fairly disjointed and have been encroached upon a lot. But if you go from one park in Louisville to the next, and they're really wonderful parks, and it's such an important part of that city. But for some reason, those parkways come to mind, and that idea that Olmsted had, that people were moving, they were going around, and how to do that, how to get people from point A to point B in a safe and an enjoyable way.